So I now have the honor of introducing our keynote panel. And we're very excited about this because based on today's title, or the title of this conference, Realities in Data, Who Counts, What Counts, and Who's Counting? Data collection, like every process in education, is extremely political, as it should be. And we want to be able today to call out some of the tensions, some of the contradictions, some of the paradoxes, some of the questions that arise as we think about how we move forward with this idea of identity-based data collection. And so today we have three distinguished speakers who are going to share their thoughts on some things that we want to consider as we move forward with this, some things that we want to be questioning ourselves, our colleagues, our school boards, our Ministry of Education, to be in constant question of how we can improve situations. I'd first like to call up, again, a founding member of the Summer Institute, Dr. Karl James. Dr. Karl James was appointed as the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora for a 5-year term effective July 1st, 2016. Dr. James brings a strong record of scholarship and community engagement to this key position, and as a chair, he will focus on addressing issues and concerns related to Black and other marginalized groups within a framework of equity, inclusivity, and justice. Committed to evidence-based policies and actions, Dr. James has extensive experience in youth studies, action research, and community work. He is widely recognized for his work in Black and other racialized communities and for his role nationally and internationally in research around equity and identification as related to race, class, gender, racialization, immigration, and citizenship. He is known for his membership and volunteer work with the social service and community agencies and educational institutions, as well as government units. Welcome, Dr. Karl James. Welcome, sir. Next, I'd like to introduce Erika Shaker. Erika Shaker is Senior Education Researcher at the National Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, where she researches, writes, and speaks on a wide range of education-related topics, from childcare to post-secondary, commercialism, privatization and corporatization, equity in education, precarity and inequality, social justice, and anti-racist education, alongside standardized testing versus authentic assessment and school funding. Erika is committed to working with educators, students, parents, and community groups across the country to help ensure that schools that are properly resourced, responsive to the needs of kids and communities, and with educators who are supported, are well positioned to help overcome rather than reinforce systemic socioeconomic inequalities and to facilitate inclusive, anti-oppressive, and caring societies. She also edits Our Schools, Ourselves, a popular education magazine founded in 1998, which the CCPA has published since 2000. Welcome, Erika Shaker. And last but certainly not least, Diane Longboat. Diane Longboat is a member of the Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan situated in Six Nations Grand River Territory, Canada. A ceremonial leader, teacher of Indigenous spiritual ways, and healer, Diane's commitment speaks to the heart of nation building for First Nations based on traditional teachings, spiritual guidance, and the ancient messages of land. Diane is the founder of Soul of the Mother, a not-for-profit initiative established in 2009 to support the sacred fire of peace that was lit in 1994 on the shores of the Grand River to pray for the spiritual evolution of humanity and the healing of Mother Earth. The ceremonial lodge has been home to thousands of First Nations youth and adults and families, international visitors, and faith leaders from many traditions. Today, Diane works at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, bringing traditional Indigenous healing to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit clients and patients as a standard of care, placing traditional healing as part of the treatment planning and establishing policies for traditional ceremonies at CAMH. Diane is co-chair, along with Bob Joulet, planning the Indigenous program for the Parliament of the World's Religions that will meet here in Toronto in November 2018 and host 12,000 visitors from 80 countries. Finally, Diane is the Indigenous Education Advisor to the Premier of Ontario and to the Ontario Ministry of Education. Welcome, Diane. So as we move into this morning's keynote panel, I'd like you to think about questions that you may have. After we hear from our three speakers today, we will open up the floor to questions. We have 2 mics in both of the aisles, and we welcome you to engage in conversation. We want this conference, we want today, we want tomorrow to be very much about dialogue, how we move forward, how we think, questions that we have, paradoxes that we're identifying. And so I'd like to begin by by asking Dr. Karl James to speak.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the recognition and introduction, and for asking me to do this. I did suggest when I was asked that somebody else should do it, but Vidya insisted. So I titled what I have to say, Data, for what purpose and in whose interest? And those are questions I want us to consider seriously. In writing about the novel Up From Freedom, Wayne Grady, who was the author by Up From Freedom by Wayne Grady, in the Toronto Star of Friday, August 10th, Sue Carter begins by saying, in 1995, Wayne Grady visited his hometown of Windsor, Ontario, to research his Irish roots. The Kingston-based science writer and translator hoped to learn where in Ireland his parental family originated from, with the intention of taking his dad overseas for a surprise 70th birthday trip. But what started as a loving gift turned to a shock when Grady uncovered a life-altering secret. As the records revealed, Grady's great-grandfather was born in the US and identified in the 1890 Windsor census as Black. And the article goes on to say, throughout his adult life, Grady's dad had passed as white and kept the truth from his family, including his wife. Despite this, his father denied racial identity until his death. Grady continued to say, I had no idea who I was or where I was from. Then it all fell into place when, years later, all the questions I had about the way we were raised and why we were not in touch with my father's side of the family made sense. I referenced this article to call attention to the fact that data, and racial identity data in particular, has long been a way in which Canada has taken note of who comprise its population. Take, for example, the 1900s data. And it tells us the 1900 census says Canada is primarily a British or French Christian agricultural male-governed country. Most people, almost 63%, live on farms, not in cities. The vast majority, about 90%, have their roots in British Isles. And it continues. And so we now get a sense of Canada as it exists. Indeed, how else would Canada have ensured that it remained a white country? As Prime Minister Mackenzie King announced in the House of Commons in 1947, Canada is perfectly within her right in selecting the persons whom we regard as desirable future citizens. It's not a fundamental human right of any alien to enter Canada. Thus, it is a privilege. It is a matter of domestic policy. The people of Canada do not wish, as a result of mass immigration, to make fundamental alterations in the character of our population. Consider 71 years later, similarly, a parliamentarian said, in addition to other things, he said, Trudeau's extreme multiculturalism and cult of diversity will divide us into little tribes that have less and less in common. And the other tweet says, cultural balkanization brings distrust social conflict, and potential violence, and we are seeing everywhere. It's time to reverse this trend before the situation gets worse. The point is, Canada has never been and will never be a colorblind society, despite claims shrouded in the Multicultural Act or policy. But it is worth thinking, how can Canadians claim to be multicultural without having the data to show it? Indeed, one of the big terms that we hear voiced by Torontonians or the politicians of Toronto, we like our diversity, we appreciate our diversity. And often then, what do we mean by diversity if we're going to be a colorblind society? Interestingly, colorblindness means race is not used in identifying people, but it is used nevertheless when we see photographs and pictures and you want to show diversity in organizations or institutions. For me, it is important to reflect on the current discourse that might serve to avoid, silence, and suppress the need to know about the population of Canada. People whom we serve in schools, colleges, universities, social services, courts, and correctional institutions. How can we effectively engage students in an educational institution and programs that will serve their needs, interests, aspirations, and expectations if we do not know who they are? More to the point, how can we effectively work with young people and understand the stories they tell about their lives if we do not know something about their backgrounds? Note that Grady did not understand anything about himself, some of the things about himself, until his father's racial identity was revealed. Clearly, I'm making the case for the collection, use, sharing, and distribution of data. But we might ask, will or can data help? Will data help us address issues pertaining to low participation, underperformance, underachievement of students in schools, or their lack of access? I need to acknowledge here, as I make the argument for the need for data, that I'm making this argument in the institution in which I work. And one of the many advocates for evidence institutions, such as yours, particular evidence-based information to inform decision. In fact, Canada, like almost all, if not all universities in Canada, do not collect data on their students. So I'm acknowledging the hypocrisy here. What kind of data? And who should collect, analyze, and interpret the data? Shouldn't race be one of the identity characteristics that we seek to explore in obtaining demographic data? David Gilburn and colleagues in 2017 article write, quantitative data tends to enjoy heightened esteem among policymakers, media, and the general public. It is often assumed to be objective and factual, whereas qualitative data is frequently dismissed as subjective and impressionistic. They go on to say that policymakers, the media, and many academics treat quantitative material as if it is fundamentally different and superior to qualitative data. Numbers are assumed to report the facts. They're seen as authoritative, neutral, dispassionate, and objective. Indeed, governments do not use numbers to describe the world. They increasingly use statistics as a central part of the technology by which they seek to reshape educational systems. In this way, numbers play a key role in how inequality is shaped, legitimized, and protected. This has been called policy as numbers. Gilbert and his colleagues therefore recommend a critical race theoretical approach in collecting, analyzing, interpreting, and reporting on data. They call this QuantCrit, which is And some of the major points are, and I have them there, the centrality of racism as a complex and deeply rooted aspect of society that is not readily amenable to quantification. Numbers are not neutral and should be interrogated for their role in promoting deficit analysis that serve wide racial interests. Categories are neither neutral nor given, and so the units and forms of analysis must be critically evaluated. Voice and insight are vital. Data cannot speak for itself, and critical analysis should be informed by the experiential knowledge of marginalized groups. Statistical analyses have no inherent value that can play a role in struggles for social justice. The point that numbers have no objective reality beyond the frameworks of meaning and politics that create them. And the authors warn that in the absence of a critical race-conscious perspective, quantitative analysis would tend to remake and legitimize existing race inequities. From this perspective, then, as I always say, the category visible minority, the way that we primarily report on racialized people in the data, should be not the way we go about reporting and engaging data. I should note that the United Nations in March 2007 indicated to Canada that the use of the term visible minorities to report on non-whites was racist and discriminatory, and it was not in the interest of racialized people. Nevertheless, it remains in use in Canada. Such data that's always lumped as visible minority should be disaggregated, and the same must be said for Indigenous people. In this regard, it is expected that Indigenous people should also be disaggregated, and some of the categories might be First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Interestingly, the long-form census that we tend to use that collects data with regard to race does not use the word race on that. Sorry. The census says, this question collects information in accordance with the Employment Equity Act and its regulations and guidelines to support programs that promote equal opportunity for everyone who share in the social, cultural, and economic life of Canada. That's how the census says it. And as you see the list there, and one of the things when I first started looking at the census form and the question, and I go through, notice Blacks is the only one listed, apart from white, Blacks is the only one listed with regard to race among the racialized people. Ultimately, however, sociologists have long recognized that ethnic and racial identifications are complex and do not easily or neatly fit into these categories in which people are identified. Indeed, people do not have just one, but several identities and categories and ethnicities into which they fit. We must pay attention to the interlocking relationship or intersectionality of these identity categories, even when to do justice to these categories. It is noted that data of racialized people should be part of the collection and analysis of data, particularly those pertaining to, it is noted that racialized people should be part of the collection and analysis of data, particularly if the data is about them. They bring a lived experience to the interpretation and the data that is necessary for them to pay attention to. I recently conducted a focus group with 9 grade 8 Black male students in a school board. 7 of the 9 identified themselves as going to a high school. They were in grade 8, and they're going to high school, and their choice of high school was based on the fact that the likelihood of them getting into a sports team, getting on a sports team. I thought, because of, I'm constantly watching and paying attention as a racialized person, as a Black person, to how Black students negotiate high school through sports. I was particularly interested in why they would say sports, as that would inform them and influence them to go to that particular school. So as a person conducting the interview, I was able to explore that. And in working with others who might use this data, we were able to discuss and talk further about this. And that's, I use that example to say that teams should always be multiracial, because especially in today's society, when we are talking of the richness of information, the richness of what needs to be communicated, then we need to have multiracial teams. And too often I see that avoided when we're paying attention to people's experiences and data. Donna Kwon writes in the Unlocking Students' Potential Through Data that the lack of data leaves gaps in our understanding of the disparities faced by many groups of students. And she continues to suggest additional demographic data must be collected. Subcategories be considered in the collection. Data, especially in its disaggregated form, is necessary in Ontario schools and every other areas, as data enable the critical decision-making needed to achieve equitable educational outcomes for young people and for Canadians generally. Community members must be educated about data. Because I say this because I'm very aware that while it's nice to be able to have data about Black students, for example, it's not necessarily that parents and community members like the idea, because of the fear that they have of the data being used to further stereotype and continue to disadvantage those students. So that education of students, of parents and students must be accompanied and should be continued from here on in. Similarly, students must be educated, and it's not just principals who should be knowledgeable about the data. Teachers in every school should, and everywhere else, should also pay attention to and give their blessing to data collection, so that they too can use the data in their work with the students, if we're going to get students where we want them to be in the Canadian society. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dr. James. I'd like to call up Erika Shaker next.
Thanks, Vidya. Thank you, Dr. James. So I'm with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ottawa, our national office. For our 30th anniversary a few years ago, we celebrated with dinner and a conference. And like good lefties, we invited other good lefties to the conference to listen to other good lefties. And I don't mean to sound flippant, because these are people I have a tremendous amount of love and respect for, discuss social programs, democracy, unions, and the left. We kicked things off with a panel, The Erosion of Democracy and Equality in Canada, which is pretty standard lefty stuff. We had Jim Stanford, we had Linda McQuaig, you get the picture. And then one speaker lambasted us. She told us that the institutional left was too comfortable in the belief that we stand for social programs would somehow knee-jerkily resonate with marginalized communities badly served by programs that had been deeply underfunded and were hard for those most in need to access effectively. They're angry and feel betrayed, she said. And if we're being totally honest, the often used slogan, unions, the people who gave you the weekend, might not have much personal significance for people who work weekends and nights and irregular hours and in dangerous, precarious jobs. She continued, those communities you claim to speak on behalf of, you think they'll back you? You think they aren't looking at conservative candidates who are openly catering to and capitalizing on their grievances and their fears and will be campaigning on them, she asked? Don't kid yourselves. That was in 2010. Rob Ford had just become mayor of Toronto, a precursor of things to come. It was also, to a great extent, when the right in Canada began to claim populism for its own. Obviously, the right doesn't have a monopoly on populism. People want to make sense of their world, and they want to feel as though their grievances and struggles are recognized, matter, and will be addressed. In the absence of data and research that responds to that desire with actual solutions, acknowledgement and reinforcement can be temporarily sufficient, especially during an election. You do work hard. When things don't work out, it isn't fair. Someone else has it easier. Vote for me, I'm gonna make it better. There is significant evidence that inequality leads to a rise in populism, of some communities feeling betrayed by large institutions, including government, turning inward to try and develop their own narratives and supports. Others are perversely drawn to autocratic leaders who, while criticizing the nanny state, insist that they, like father, know best. And depending on the community, the leader, or the narrative, the focus can be less about solutions, which take work, and more about scapegoats. And because the most convenient scapegoats are almost always those who historically have been socioeconomically marginalized and oppressed, that rhetoric finds a home in white supremacist circles that continue to proliferate, not just in Canada, not just in the US, but Canada as well. We just elected in Ontario a government, in part because of this superficial appeal to those who felt ignored by previous governments and who can't catch a break and who don't care if their perception is backed up by data. People want their experiences validated, and thanks to the proliferation of facts, alternative facts, perspectives, and platforms, it's easy to become very comfortably outraged in a carefully crafted echo chamber of your own or someone else's making. This is something progressive think tanks and researchers are grappling with. Often our research is resisted precisely because it does not provide validation, but rather disrupts it. That doesn't mean we can't change minds. It does mean, however, that we need to think about how we frame, translate, and disseminate our research and data that underpins it so that it doesn't just get discarded, although depending on the audience, that may happen no matter what, as fake news or left-wing propaganda. As a researcher, I generally err on the side of more rather than less data and information. But in an era of fake news, can more data or even better data make the difference? How do we consider the tendency of the public across the political spectrum, in many cases, to lower its defenses and critical faculties in response to data that capitalizes on our desire for factual evidence of what we feel is true or what we would like to be true? What about data that contradicts deeply held beliefs about equity and the benefits of living in Canada, particularly when compared to Trump's America? What if those meanwhile in Canada videos are crap? Tim Hortons coffee is dreadful. Sleeping in a car while Indigenous can get you executed by a white farmer with impunity. White supremacy is alive and well in our home on Native land. Children of color are disproportionately disciplined in school. Women still manage to get themselves assaulted, harassed, and paid less on the dollar, particularly women of color. And turns out we have nothing, absolutely nothing, to be smug about. But Trump has given the Canadian status quo so much cover. I was at a family reunion last month in West Virginia. We can talk about that later. It was good, where the political conversations were numerous and heated, as you may expect. Is it better to live in Canada or in the US? One borderline libertarian Canadian cousin demanded. I guess it depends, I answered. For you, probably Canada. For some of the most marginalized communities, it probably doesn't matter much. He didn't like that. Granted, I didn't provide him with on-reserve child poverty stats to make my case, but I'm not sure it would have mattered if I had. Because in spite of the national leaven when the census once again became mandatory, Proof of injustice will always be resisted by those who have a vested interest in maintaining the privilege-protecting illusion that everything is just fine, or who maintain progressive change as capitulation to special interests or the tyranny of political correctness. Sorry for all the scare quotes. I don't know if my sarcasm comes across all the time, so I feel like I need. Data is used to prove that something is significant or that it isn't. But so is the absence of data, which leaves truisms or biases unchallenged, or reinforces the assumption that if you can't count something or someone, they literally don't count. Who, for example, is disappeared from the equation and from potential policy solutions when poverty is so narrowly defined that it reduces the numbers without reducing the human toll. And this question takes on additional significance given yesterday's announcement of Canada's first poverty reduction strategy. Given resistance to inconvenient facts like poverty, how do we continue to push for and promote the data that we need to advocate for the progressive change we want in our classrooms and our communities? How do we make the numbers and the research accessible and relevant to lived experiences so that we can identify policy weaknesses and propose policy improvements that truly are transformative? How do we make sure it resonates and gets to those who need to hear it, to those whose minds can be changed by it, and to those who are in a position to use it effectively? Progressive think tanks conduct analysis that challenges current or proposed policy, providing content for arguments in favor of progressive policy solutions, and use research to change the parameters of what is accepted, what is or isn't working, and whose realities are included or excluded. What has become more important, I think, in the post-truth world, although assuming that this is a new reality, because I think it's probably more accurate to say that what has actually changed is the amplification of the misinformation platform, is to make that research and that data relevant, accessible, and reflective. What does it mean and why does it matter? Who is hurt by it and who is helped? The CCPA has one foot in the think tank world and one in the NGO world. And I think this is a huge strength because it's a constant reminder that our research can't just speak to policymakers. It needs to speak for, in response to, and in some cases in defense of communities most impacted by policy and policy changes. And it needs to speak to the public in deconstructing current policy and proposing solutions to structural deficiencies. As frustrating as the ongoing back and forth over the role of charities and their ability to engage in political activity has been, I think it's potentially, I am an optimist, a useful opportunity to talk about the relationship between research and analysis and accessibility and engagement. This is something we're continuing to try to do better at, in part through our more collaborative work with the alternative federal budget and the more community-focused work of our provincial offices. For me, that dual role is really evident in the work I do in education, a sector that's rooted in community and community development. It's something that pretty much everyone has an opinion on, which can be challenging, especially when those opinions are informed by classism or racism, or as we see in the debates over sex education, simply spending too much time on anti-choice websites. But it also means that it's a venue for broad civic and community involvement. With growing disillusionment, disenfranchisement, and disconnection with bureaucracies, education on a local level provides us with a valuable opportunity to disrupt misinformation campaigns that capitalize on public distrust. Organizing around schools can help us build community, test our realities and our understanding of the issues, and help us to engage and be engaged. But, and this is a huge caveat, this will only work if we learn how to shut the hell up and listen to the deeply socioeconomic, unequal ways in which kids experience school, as a positive or relatively uneventful experience, as a refuge, or as anything but a safe and nurturing space. Those well-meaning public education supporters cannot afford the luxury of defensiveness. The stakes at all levels are too high. Doug Ford will mercilessly exploit this populist distrust of large bureaucracies, of which he's a part, ironically, to his benefit. But I'm less interested in how he misrepresents Ontario's math scores, for example, as the lowest in the country, when in actuality they're second only to Quebec's, than I am in why so many people are willing to believe him, even when confronted with data that proves he's wrong. I'm not advocating that, I'm not suggesting that I actually take those math scores seriously. I'm just using this as an example. Or at best is vastly misrepresenting the truth. We know that generally people are quite supportive of their local school, though again, this is a massive generalization, yet are still prepared to accept that it's part of an institutional framework, almost a conspiracy, that's shortchanging every kid in the province, even in the face of research indicating the exact opposite. Can the local school and its connections to the communities within and surrounding it provide us with a venue to cut through the distrust and sense of betrayal and better understand the relevance of data that's required to make decisions to ensure schools and the entire system can serve all kids better? This is what I think. At its best, education provides a way into discussions or to facilitate connections that might otherwise never happen. It puts kids and communities at the heart of the conversation. Who is helped, who is hurt, and what don't I know when it comes to what's best for not just my kid? And it's a segue to conversations about taxation, spending, justice, racism, colonialism, health and well-being, food security, housing, topics that some people don't feel equipped to jump right into, but can find their way to through discussions about the local school. As an education researcher, I'm interested in the tensions between insufficient or non-existent data, the data you know, the data you don't, such as, for example, how difficult it is to find out how many education workers are precariously employed, never mind trying to get that data disaggregated by gender or race. Or data that's used for a purpose that is fundamentally unhelpful and does not measure what it claims to, like standardized tests, which purport to quantify the educational experience of kids, but actually say much more about how we as a society have let certain kids, schools, and communities down. Or data that does not reflect or elaborate on how people differently experience the trends being studied, like anything that requires self-disclosure in the context of voluntary fundraising or fees, for example. Or the truisms and slogans that dot the policy discussion landscape, many of which are used to underpin and justify policy decisions that are incomplete or wrong-headed or regressive, like a handful. The economy has never been stronger. For whom and at whose expense? More money in your pocket? At what cost? And why are some pockets so much bigger than others? Middle class, who does this category and the policies purporting to target it include beyond campaign slogans? Merit, based on what indicators and ignoring which others? Universal social program, universal in principle or in delivery, accessibility, quality, and accountability to everyone, especially the most marginalized. Also, a hand up, not a handout, a rising tide lifts all boats, no child left behind. At its best, good data gets at what's behind the truisms and the slogans. It allows for due diligence when it comes to understanding how policy works, or if it works, and how we define success, which must include who's left behind. And the more contextualized it is, the more it can matter to the people who need it most, or the people who truly want systems that work better for all of us, but especially the most marginalized, because that should be how we define and work for progress. Data and analysis that challenges rather than reinforces the status quo will always be resisted by those opposed to their privilege being revealed or overturned. But then there's the rest of us. And one more great thing about data is that it can help reveal just how many more of us there are, where our interests intersect, where those with privilege can make space rather than use up oxygen, and how much collective power we can harness for transformative and truly progressive social change. So calculators up, people. Let's make those numbers sing truth to power and be an antidote to privilege, not an expression of it. Thank you.
And next is Diane Longboat. Diane, I'm just going to pull up your PowerPoint.
So I'd like to say Segos, Ganagoa to you. Greetings and the great peace from my heart to yours. It's a real honor for me to be here at York University. I came in from Six Nations, and that's my home community. Sometimes I come in from Akwesasne, which is a 4-hour drive to get here. But it's a beautiful day to share with you today. I have not come to York University very often. My brother graduated from here with a master's degree and a doctorate and always talked to me about how great York was. So now I get to experience it for myself. So I thank you for that opportunity today. I want to talk to you about data governance and ownership and control and access and possession of data within a context of First Nations. not Métis, not Inuit, because I don't have that capacity, that capability. Those communities will speak for themselves, but from a First Nations perspective. And certainly all of what I'm going to say to you is my personal perspective on context and on partnership. So one of the things, okay, one of the things that I think is really important for you to understand as Canadians sitting in this room is that each and every one of you have a duty and a responsibility to understand history from the Indigenous perspective. And that's important because of what I'm going to tell you now. In 1613, our first relationship with each other, and so I say that because we all have ancestors in this homeland, was in a wampum belt that talked about the Gaswenta, the original relationship that we made a covenant to have with each other for peace and for respect and for friendship, to share the land, to share the resources. And we provided that opportunity for your communities to thrive in our homelands. That original relationship still binds us today. We have never taken apart that wampum belt. We have never discredited it in any way. So you have as much responsibility to uphold those high values as our people do. Today, what we see is historical mistrust of governments and of data collection. And the reason for that is the loss of our homelands and our resources. So we say today that 99.8% of the lands have been taken from us, regardless of treaties and covenants and wampum belts and agreements and friendship agreements. And we live on 0.2%. And laws in this country say that it's going to be very difficult if First Nations want to add to their community's land base. Think about the trust funds that were established by the Government of Canada for the lease and sale of First Nations lands, done largely by Indian agents without our participation and without our agreement. Those trust funds built the legislature in Ontario. Those trust funds built McGill University. And those trust funds built significant parts of the University of Toronto. We have today mistrust. It's not just historical, but it's contemporary. That mistrust was evidenced to me in the Yukon 3 weeks ago, where one of the elders took me to his old village site where he was born and where he grew up until he was about 8 years old. And in that old village site were magnificent rivers that converged, and there were incredible fishing grounds. And he said he remembers very clearly the day that the provincial government, the Government of Canada, and the RCMP came and said to the people, "You no longer have a right to live on this land. You will be dispersed. Your clan houses and your ceremonial houses will be dismantled, and you will leave this area." And they took all the children and they put them in residential schools. And so that, standing in that place, I asked him, I said, "How was it for you living free here on the land and being self-sustaining and living in concert with the natural laws and the spiritual laws that the Creator gave to your people? What year was that you were removed from these lands?" And he said 1948. So this, what we are speaking about here in terms of mistrust and use of data, collection of data, whose view of data, this is not something that is historical to the sense of this elder, was probably 4 years older than I am. That was his living memory of dealing with governments. And so who occupies that land today? The Department of Fisheries and Oceans, because they set up fish counting stations there, because our people knew how great and abundant those rivers were. So today, when I talk to you about data, I want you to understand that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have a place in the Canadian Constitution, that we have rights over and above Canadian people, over and above Canadian people. And so those rights are going to be talked about in a few minutes with regard to the ownership of data. So those reconciliation calls to action from 2015 talk about us living in a new era, working together. And I think that's an important piece for us to remember, that every Canadian person should have a copy of those 94 calls to action. And every Canadian person should pick out those calls to action that really call to your heart for implementation. Because if you don't have a real sense of your duty and responsibility in this country, then things are not going to change. And if there's anything that we need help with in this country, it is change. But we have to do it together, and we have to do it standing shoulder to shoulder. So reconciliation in this time period is all about nation building. And I want to just share with you some ideas about data collection and governance, talking about a true partnership. So if you belong to schools, you belong to school boards, you work for the Ministry of Education, this all applies to you, because First Nations governments, we are not cultural groups, marginalized groups, racialized groups. We are members and citizens of First Nations governments working and functioning within the borders of Canada. Those First Nation governments have ownership over the data of their citizens, on or off the territory, whether you're in the community or whether you're living in the city. And we need to be full partners with those institutions collecting data so that we can provide a very important lens. And that means that data governance agreements need to be put in place. And so for all those school boards who have tuition agreements with First Nation communities, data governance agreements are really critical. We need to help you to understand the context of experience of our children in your school systems. We need to talk about engagement of Indigenous parents, achievement, and what is achievement? How are you defining achievement? How would we as First Nations define achievement? What is the cultural capital that an Indigenous student brings into your classroom? What is that cultural capital? How do you figure that into how you're dealing with the student in the classroom on a daily basis? There's also OCAP principles, so ownership, control, access, and possession. Those are important pieces to consider, because when you have ownership over data, you're going to tell the story in the way that that family, that individual student, that community has a lens over what that experience is all about inside your school systems. So if we say that authority over First Nations student data lies with First Nations governments, that means we have to look at issues of confidentiality, of privacy, of the interpretation of that data, control of the data, access to the data, possession of it. And so those ethical considerations in data governance and community protocols can only really be understood when school boards have a significant relationship with those First Nations in their regions. So I want to suggest to you today that we need to have a community-driven model in partnership with school boards and First Nations to provide a different view of what is accessibility, what is achievement, what is engagement, what are the systemic barriers, what is well-being and how do we define that, academic tutoring and some of the services that we need, mentoring, mental health needs, financial needs, access to elders for traditional knowledge systems and definitions of student success. And I really want to honor our elder this morning, Lorene, who did that opening ceremony for us. That opening ceremony was a significant piece, not only because it joined us all together in one spirit, looking at the issue that's in front of us, but it connects something very important, and that is the natural world that we live in and the spiritual world. When she burned that medicine and she said those words over us and she made a call out to spirit to join us, and particularly our ancestors, what happened in that moment was that the spirit world and the natural world came together to touch. And when they touch, there's magic that happens. You're going to find that this conference maybe leads you into creativity, it leads you into innovation, it gives you a sense of courage and fearlessness to be bold, to knock down the walls of what convention and society and mathematicians might say, this is the only way forward. It's going to give you that opportunity. So I want to suggest then that school boards and partnerships with First Nations governments harmonize their IT systems so that they're compatible for the collection of data. That we design together some questions that provide baseline data, allow room for regional variations, of course, but also add questions to meet local diversity. Because the school board, the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, is not going to be the same as the Aurora Borealis School Board in the area of Thunder Bay. So we need to develop, in order to get to that point, we need to develop a community of practice in every school board that is going to be developing relationships with the First Nations governments of the regions. And I know you already have those advisory councils, and I want to speak to those advisory councils as well. So at some point, we have to apply a systems view of what we are doing in education. Because those Aboriginal advisory councils of school boards need to have decision-making capacity along with board members. And yes, the Education Act says we can have trustees sitting on those school boards. But those Aboriginal education advisory councils now should be standing committees of the board. They should have decision-making powers that bring that needed information into that board level beyond what the trustee will contribute at those meetings. So school trustees, they have a direct relationship with chief and councils, but we need to go further. Those Indigenous school trustees can be the doorway into the First Nations, chiefs and councils and communities in those regions. I suggest that those school boards have meetings in First Nation communities, that you start to know the people that you're serving in a way that is deeper than seeing a brown face come into that door and knowing that they come from Saugeen, knowing that they come from Mississaugas of the New Credit, but not really knowing the community, or seeing the community at powwow time, but never then having a deep relationship with the leaders of the community, with the educators of the community, the school system in the community, and the elders of the community. So I say to have school board meetings in First Nation communities, to open dialogue after the school board meeting is over, to community dialogue, to have discourse with the community, and to allow those First Nation communities to have an opportunity to express those concerns that they have about our children in your system. School boards also need to prepare annual reports of their progress for student achievement. We always talk about student achievement from what the child brings into the classroom. But I want to say to schools and to school boards, you have a duty and responsibility to report to First Nation communities about your progress of achievement in educating our children. How do you provide Indigenous curriculum? How do you provide culturally responsive assessment? Are you providing land-based learning? Is there an opportunity in the curriculum for heritage language learning? Is there mental health support? Students in the school? Are elders present in the school systems? So well-being measures need to be defined to provide First Nations. Our well-being is a little bit different from how you would define well-being. You will never know that without relationship. So there are measures of equity that also need to be looked at. I want to suggest to you that there's a new lens that needs to be put over data. That new lens involves partnership and understanding the context of community. It also involves the school board self-examining its own progress in educating our children. You have a duty and responsibility in those tuition agreements that we signed to put our children into your system to report back. We are partners in this process. This is not a financial transaction. This is a partnership. And, you know, one of the things that I say to you about shifting the lens, so on September 11th, 12th, and 13th, the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network is offering a very important 3-night series for Canadians who have a narrative about our people. So they've taken in this series a number of Canadians randomly, and they've asked them, they filmed them and they asked them, what's your impression of First Nations people? Well, they're addicted, they are homeless, they are uneducated, they are a drain on our system. So you know the narrative, it goes on. That same group of people spent 28 days traveling to visit various First Nations communities. And it chronicles their emotional, mental, spiritual transition from that narrative to the counter-narrative. That lens changed in that series. So APTN, September 11th to the 13th, and it's called First Contact. And so if we are going to make a shift in data, in equity, in well-being, in culturally responsive education, in building a school system that is world-class here, we need to work together. This is not an us and them situation. This is a collective consciousness that is resonating at a higher level than the populism, than the fear-mongering, than the people who say that's going to cost too much money. We can afford not to do it. We cannot afford not to do it. Because if we believe in this country, we believe in Canada and each other, we need to really do our best work together. And that involves you understanding our context. We certainly understand your context. And we need to form really important partnerships to be able to work together. And I really want to thank you as educators for the work that you do in the school system. It's not easy. I think it's one of the toughest jobs. It is, you know, you're bound by many, many regulations. And so to do your best work and to be creative within that environment is really difficult. But I say to you as First Nations educators and leaders in this country that, you know, together we can dismantle a colonial education system that is not serving any of our students in the way that it needs to serve our students. We need to color in those white spaces that were created in 1867 with a certain view of what this country can be. And so we're not ever going to do it alone, but we're going to do it together. So I want to thank you today for this privilege of being here.
Just before we continue, if we can please give a huge round of applause for our three panelists tonight. We ask that that you think about what you'd like to share, and please join in on the conversation. Given time constraints, we ask that you please try to keep your comments or your questions as brief as possible. And what we'll do is we'll take a couple of questions to begin with, and then we'll have our panelists respond in groups. All right, so we'll begin over here with this mic, and then we'll move over to this one.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. My name's Annie Kidder. I'm the Executive Director of People for Education. And my question has to do with, I think Diane brought it up most at the end, but it has to do with then how we measure success or well-being or any of those things. So we're on a we're on in a movement to have more identity-based data, to be able to understand more who's there, more about them. But we still, in the end, right now, when we're talking about success, the only thing we have to compare that data with is scores in reading, writing, and math. Reading, writing, and math are obviously very, very important. But when you're thinking about the use of demographic data to understand more about what's going on in our system, are you thinking about other things that we can use then to describe overall success? Our concern in People for Education is that because we only have, in terms of the educational, we only have achievement data in those narrow areas, we end up kind of narrowing the system, and perhaps not, one of our arguments now is that we never move the equity needle because we actually have the wrong needle, and that it's time to start looking at not only all of the data that you've talked about, but the other piece of that. So I just wonder what your thinking is on that.
Thank you, Annie. So we're just going to take one more question, and then we're going to pause and allow the panelists some time to think while we change the, I forget the term, but something at the back so that we maintain the sound. Go ahead, Michael.
Just for Diane, I'm an equity lead within the field of child welfare. And we do have a provincial table that meets to address issues around AO and equity and so forth. And we also have a department that deals with Indigenous issues and so forth. My question is, oftentimes various institutions and various sectors operate in silos. We don't share data, we don't share information, we don't work together. Our equity leads and tables meet separately, oftentimes at the same time but separately. Folks could be in Collingwood meeting around education matters in terms of equity leads. We could be downtown meeting around child welfare matters. But we often see and share, we service the same families, for lack of a better word, because oftentimes I had to double think that because often families don't want our services for good reasons in terms of not wanting us to be involved and being intrusive in their lives. So my question really, I guess, really centers around how can we begin? What are some of the suggestions you might have that we might begin to think together, share data, share information, work together, so that we would, operate differently? I've seen some stats in terms of how Indigenous young people are doing in various sectors, and it's really dismal. So that's my question to you.
I'm going to answer those too.
Thank you, Diane.
So thank you so much for your questions. Really appreciate them. The first one for Annie. So I'm the fan of People for Education. Never met Annie Kidder, so thanks for asking the first question. I wanted to just say that there is a whole movement in First Nations education to develop new standards. And those standards are very different from the ones that you have currently in your system. So I would refer you to Kenjigewinteg Educational Institute, which is up near Manitoulin Island. They have a beautiful set of K to 6, the ones that I saw, K to 6 standards in education that they want their students to fulfill to graduate to the next level, 7, 8, and then on to high school. There's also well-being measures that have been developed by Indigenous organizations invited to come inside the Ministry of Education and provide a paradigm for what is well-being from the First Nations perspective. That is also really important for you to know, because the kinds of questions that you're asking about decolonizing the system, or some people would call it indigenizing the system, those kinds of pieces that you would see in our child well-being paradigm model and in the education standards would be good for all children. They are kind, they are compassionate, they are empathetic, they are demanding academic excellence, challenging the child to be greater than he or she thinks she can be, building young women with confidence, building young men also with confidence, teaching young people how to honor and respect one another. So those are really important models for you that you might want to refer to. The other piece about child equity, and I think this is an important piece on partnership. So about 3 years ago in Kingston, they had a gathering called Vital Signs. And at that gathering in Kingston, there was a model that was presented that is now working in Guelph, Hamilton, Kitchener, Toronto, Winnipeg, and various points west. That model gathers together individuals to sit at the table across the spectrum once a week, and they examine a case once a week. So health, education, child welfare is present, social services present, and the police, so the criminal justice system present. And they have a set of principles in which they're going to look at a particular case of a child and a family. And they examine that, and collectively they say, and they problem solve, how can we support that young person, that child, that family, to be the strongest that it can be within our community? What is it of all these services that we have that we can bring to bear to support them? So I think those kinds of models are the new way forward. They are models that cut across all those silos, and they bring voices to the table. So I want to put that out there, that in the currents of society, culture is changing in the currents of society in Canada, and culture is demanding more of an integrated approach now. So we need as educators to get on board with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. Would Erika or Karl, would you like to add to that, or?
No, quite quickly, I would say, with regard to Annie's question, which I quite liked, is this is 2018, and how are we using measures in 2018, the same measures that we used many, many years ago? And so I think there's a need to start thinking right now of how we're going to measure, really, what we're going to consider achievement, what we're going to consider performance, especially in the context when students sometimes are not learning from teachers or in the classroom, but elsewhere, and how we're going to pay that into. So there needs to be, I think, some kind of investigation, some look, let me use a traditional Canadian word, the task force. that might start exploring this and coming up with something that we may go forward with. And it will be useful. And by the way, I'd always say that that task force must be diverse.
I don't think I could add anything to that would be worth taking up time to do so. So thanks very much. And thank you for your answers. And thanks for the questions.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take 2 more questions. Sam?
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentations. I had a question, I guess, for Karl. I'm thinking about the call for data and the intersectionality. And I'm wondering what you think about the possibilities of the quantification of intersectionality. That's one question. And I got a question for is Erika Shaker, right? Correct. Thank you. And I really liked your presentation in the sense that I think what we're glossing over sometimes in the call for more data is the idea that we're producing a capital T truth that will get to people. So I wonder what you think might be the task for how we would produce data or facts that would break through the emotional or the worldview that people want it to conduce to. And just one more for Diane. No, I think it was very provocative, so I want to follow in that line. I heard you had opened your presentation with saying that everybody has ancestors here and that we're all Canadian. I wondered about the classrooms and the makeups in the universities here where I teach, and thinking about student bodies that think ancestral lands are somewhere else for them, right? So thinking about the different histories of how people got to this part of the world. So how you might address that. And you had a provocative statement, the rights above and over Canadian people. Just wanted to give you a chance to elaborate on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll take 1 more question from this side, and then we'll turn to our speakers.
Hi, my name is Camille. I'm the Durham District School Board's equity facilitator, and recently had a chance to travel to Winnipeg to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, where I met someone named Kevin Lemeroux, who is one person doing a lot of work. And so my question is sort of a bit of a moral imperative, I felt, because he asked something of me, which I'm going to ask us all to reflect on. He informed me when I was there that the testimony that was given by survivors around residential schools, that's data. And it's not quantitative, it's stories. That data will be destroyed. It has a 15-year life, and it's going to be destroyed within the next 8 years or so. And he asked that I spread this message on so that we can think about what is it that we can do. He said that the people that gave testimony have to sign some sort of legal documentation to make sure that that data goes on existing. And I think that's really important. As we're teachers, we're teaching about residential schools, we need to make sure that these stories don't die. So I maybe look for some counsel on how to go about supporting his work. He's one person, and a lot of our jobs, I think we can sort of identify with the feeling of being a small crew of people doing a large task, and so how we can support these people whose stories were very, it was a re-traumatization for many of them to go through the account and tell what was done to them. So that's my sort of call to you, but also question of what we can do to support.
Thank you, Camille. So I'll turn it over to the panel.
The quantification of intersectionality was the question, correct? I don't know, actually. One of the things that we keep talking when we talk about collecting data is that race intersects with gender, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting for me has always been is how often when we hear gender talked about, we just simply say gender and sometimes never think of how it intersects with others. And as we moved from the discussion of equity related to gender and talk about gender, we moved from there, then we started moving from, we said gender and then the others are listed, rather than seeing all of them as intersecting. I'm never quite sure how intersectionality is taken up or understood, because it seems as if it's difficult for us to start holding all these balls at the same time. And so there is some work to be done, really, in really taking up intersectionality very, very well. But also intersectionality and which one we take up at a particular time has to be in context. We have to constantly think which one is operated in this context in a significant way compared to another. So it's not necessarily just simply we're taking up intersectional, we're taking up race, but which is important in this at the time that we're trying to work with.
Just to, your question is sort of that relationship between truth and experience. And I think that for me, that's something we're really grappling with, where we're in the business of getting as much research and data as we possibly can through the mechanisms that we have at our disposal. Generally, Statistics Canada, but there are others as well. And sometimes that involves literally calling up every childcare center in the country to find out what fees are, which we have also done. I like the idea. I like the discussion we've had about really understanding what data and research is more broadly, that it's also what people bring to the discussion. So I think that you can find that number from StatsCan that really gets at how many people, for example, on university and college campuses in Ontario are determined to be precariously employed or have some evidence of precarity in their jobs, which we did, but then actually going to those workers and saying, how do you experience this? And what does it mean? What does it mean to you? And using that data to inform the number and explain on a very human level what that means to people working on campus, what that means to their families, what that means to the communities in which they live. And that to me, I've found has made that data resonate so much more strongly and actually be part of a call to change how we think people at our institutions of higher learning, what they should be earning and how they should be protected and how they should be, and that relationship between the production of education, sorry, there it goes again, the production of education, and which is their own labor, right, which is their work. So that's something that I've been working with quite a bit, especially on what you and Karl were just speaking to as well. How do you quantify intersectionality? When it comes to precarity, that's something we're grappling with at this point. It's sort of in terms of, it's more of a description of how precarity is experienced differently. That's what we're trying, that's what we're trying to get at, and whether or not it's something that we can actually quantify with a single number, I doubt that it is. That's the question that we're really working through at this point. But how do you paint a picture broad enough that the numbers mean things to people and actually will encourage more data, more disaggregated data to different people? Precisely. I hope that answered. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just quickly comment on ancestors. So we believe as First Nations peoples that we come from an ancestral lineage, and we trace that back not thousands of years, but millions of years. And so we say to people who come into our country, into our homelands, that you also come here with your ancestral lineage, and we welcome that, because we don't believe in the discourse of fear, of scarcity. We believe in a discourse of abundance and of sharing. And you can go right across the country and you can talk to First Nations and they will tell you exactly that. And so, thinking about the newcomers who come to our homelands, that they also bring their ancestral lineage here. And so we welcome them to come here, the Syrian people who are fleeing genocide from various parts of the world. Come here and find that place of peace. And so, that's an important piece for you to understand, is ancestral connection. Because we say in our tradition, in our spirituality, that if you lose your connection to your ancestors, you become functionally mentally ill. You can function in society, but there's a form of mental illness where your own ego takes over and you think that you can control everything in front of you. And I think we have some really good leaders in the world today that exemplify that. So, thank you. And then I guess the other piece, which is our rights over and above Canadians. Yes, so for those of you who know history, and for those of you who lived history in the early 1980s when the Constitution of Canada was going to be repatriated to this country, our leaders stood in defiance of that without fullness expressed in the Constitution for our rights. And so Section 9435 is an open box in that Canadian Constitution that talks about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights. And so our job then in that nation-to-nation relationship with the Crown, now the Government of Canada, is to fill that box. Our box is filled with lands and resources. It's filled with health and with education, social services, and so on. And so those manifest through the Indian Act. Those manifest through the Department of Indigenous Programs and Services and the Department of Crown Relationships today. And so that's going also through an evolution, because there's new legislation that is coming up to replace the Indian Act. So yes, Canadians, we do have rights over and above yours. And I hope that you will support us in that, being guests in our homelands. Thank you.
Thank you. So I see that there are no final questions, and I'm sure that you all have a lot to think about. What's so exciting about this room is that we have community partners, we have grad students, we have teacher candidates, we have educators K-12, we have school board officials and central staff, we have researchers, we have folks from the ministry. It's a really exciting group, and a lot of expertise and a lot of experience and a lot of perspectives in this room. And so we really hope that as we break in a moment and move into smaller workshops, that you continue the dialogue, you continue to ask yourself questions, to ask each other questions, to ask the presenters questions. This is our moment to really be thinking about how we can move forward in transformative ways. So just before I explain to you sort of the next little bit, please give our panel another huge round of applause.